Okay, I think I'll start letting people in.
His company was also a major supplier of burlap in the area.
All right, guys, I think we'll get started. A couple points before we do start. So that's my bad for sending out the link to the PowerPoint pretty late. But for the upcoming sessions, we're probably going to send them out a little bit earlier. We just want you guys to kind of take a look at them, maybe look up some words you don't know, study it a little bit just to get the prior knowledge. Um, for psych, it's not too much of a big deal because a lot of you have seen this stuff already.
No, I wasn't like complimenting him though.
But for future meetings, we'll try and send them out a little bit earlier. Okay, so we're also going to be following these Kaplan books. I have the 22-23 year. So this is where we're getting our information from. So we're going to start with chapter 1, biology and behavior. And this is going to cover 8% of all the psych content. So I'm not too concerned with this slide right here. the main guy you should know is William James, and he's the father of functionalism. And that's pretty much studying how the mental processes help the mind to adapt to different environments. So it's pretty much asking the question, what's the function of this part of the brain? And then Pierre Florence, just know this word, ablation and extirpation. And that's just pretty much removing parts of the brain and looking at the consequences. And he did this with a lot of animals. So this is how we have a lot of our information about neuropsychology. Okay, so then for the nervous system, we have two types of neurons, actually two main ones. The first one is going to be sensory neurons. These are also known as afferent neurons. And these are going to go from the peripheral to the central nervous system. I like to think about it like sensory afferent arriving at the CNS. So it's going to be going from the peripheral to the CNS. Then you have motor neurons. These are going to be your efferent neurons. These are going to go from your central nervous system to the peripheral. I like to think about it as exiting the CNS. And then you have interneurons. They could be inhibitory or excitatory. They pretty much just connect sensory and motor neurons. And then I have this little diagram of the layout of the nervous system. Be familiar with this, it's pretty important, especially the different parts of the autonomic nervous system. Sympathetic, that's going to be your fight or flight response. And parasympathetic, that's going to be your rest and digest. So your sympathetic nervous system is going to be concerned with taking your body away from homeostasis. And the parasympathetic nervous system is going to be concerned with bringing your body back to homeostasis. Then we have the organization of the brain. So you have three major divisions of the brain, which start differentiating during development. You have your forebrain, your midbrain, and your hindbrain. So with the forebrain, this is going to be all your logic, your higher order processing, your behavior, stuff like that, cognition. It's just going to be the really more modern aspects of the brain, less ancient. You have your cerebral cortex, basal ganglia. That's going to be really important for movement. The limbic system, this is your amygdala, hippocampus, and that's going to be really important for emotion and memory. Then you have your thalamus. Every single sensory system except audition goes through the thalamus directly. And then you have your hypothalamus, which is going to control hunger, thirst, and emotions. Your midbrain, it's pretty much just two parts of the brain. It's going to be your inferior and superior colliculi. And those are just going to be sensory motor reflexes. And it receives sensory information from the spinal cord, and it's going to transmit motor information. And then you have your hindbrain. This is going to be the really ancient part of your brain. It's going to control the really old processes like breathing, walking, coordination, digestion, heart rate, stuff like that. You have your cerebellum, which is really important for fine movements. You have your medulla, which is extremely important for heart and vital reflexes. This is how your heart actually pumps. You have your reticular formation. It's going to be arousal and alertness. And then you have your pons. And that's also really important for breathing. And then we're going to go just to some scanning devices. You probably heard a lot about these CT scan. It's just taking an X-ray, a lot of X-rays, and then a computer is going to compile those X-rays. You have your PET scan, which is just an injection of glucose with some kind of tracer molecule attached to it. And this is really just looking at what cells are taking up the most glucose in your body. It's really good for cancer, detecting cancers. You have an MRI, which uses magnetic fields to get images of the inside of your body. You have your fMRI, which is going to do the same thing, except it's really good for looking at changes in blood flow. So this is a functional MRI, so you can really see how blood is moving throughout the body and which cells are getting the most blood flow. And then you have an EEG. I think it stands for electroencephalogram or something like that. But this is just pretty much monitoring brain activity via electrodes. So next we have influences on behavior. So here we're going to be talking about neurotransmitters. And these are just chemical signals used for communication between neurons. Neurons are going to release this at their presynaptic terminal, and the postsynaptic cell is going to take up these neurotransmitters. So acetylcholine is a very important one. This controls all voluntary muscle control, also a little bit of involuntary muscle control. And a disease associated with less acetylcholine is Alzheimer's. I know the MCAT likes to ask a lot of questions on diseases and which diseases are associated with which neurotransmitters. So make sure you know those. And then you have your catecholamines. Within the catecholamines, you're going to have 3 neurotransmitters: epinephrine, norepinephrine, which is going to be your fight or flight. High levels are associated with anxiety. And then you have dopamine, which is going to be like smooth movement. Dopamine controls a lot of different processes in your body. Too much of it is going to be associated with schizophrenia, and low levels are going to be associated with Parkinson's disorder. And then you have serotonin. Oh, one more thing. The catecholamines are they're organized into these 3 different neurotransmitters because each neurotransmitter can be synthesized from the previous one. So epinephrine can be synthesized from norepinephrine, and then dopamine gets synthesized from norepinephrine. So there's just like a pathway that all these 3 follow, and they could just be synthesized through each other. Next, we're going to have serotonin. This is going to regulate mood, eating, sleeping, a lot of different processes, just like dopamine. But low levels are going to be associated with depression, and then high levels are going to be associated with mania. You have your GABA and glycine. These are both going to be inhibitory neurotransmitters. And then you have glutamate, which is going to be your main excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain. And then you have endorphins, which are just natural painkillers produced by your bodies. Now we're going to move on to these primitive reflexes. So reflexes are something that infants have, but disappear with age. So the first reflex is going to be a rooting reflex. This is automatic head turning in the direction of a stimulus that touches the infant's cheek. So this is going to be really important for helping the baby find the nipple when they're breastfeeding. Then you have the moral reflex. This is when infants are going to react to abrupt movements. They fling their arms out and kind of just stand there with their arms out. And people think that this is like a way to protect babies if they were to ever fall off a tree or something. Stuff like that. It's just if they fall in the moral position, then they're less likely to get hurt. And then we're going to have the Babinski reflex. This is when you touch the bottom of an infant's foot and their toes are going to spread apart and upward automatically. And this goes away relatively fast, I believe around the age of 2, but it's replaced with something called a plantar reflex in adults. So that's just going to be the opposite. If you touch an adult's foot in a certain way, the toes are going to curl inwards. And then we have a grasping reflex. And this is when infants close their fingers around an object placed in their hand. And you can look at these reflexes and see how they're developing in infants. And these are going to be known as development milestones. And each one of these reflexes has an expected time to start and an expected time to kind of go away in the development of the child. So if the time isn't following the development milestones, then there might be some kind of neurological condition. Now we're going to move on to threshold. So a threshold is the minimum amount of a stimulus that renders a difference in perceptions. So there's going to be 3 types of threshold. There's going to be absolute threshold. So this is the minimum amount of stimulus needed to activate a sensory system. So this doesn't involve any conscious perception at all. This is all completely unconscious. And this is looking at the molecular level. So how much do you have to, or how hard do you have to touch a person for a neuron to fire an action potential? That would be the absolute threshold of that neuron. Threshold of conscious perception is very similar, except this is where the amount of stimulus needed to actually perceive the stimulus. And this is pretty much just conscious perception. It doesn't have anything to do with a sensory system firing or not. It's if you can actually know, like you're looking at something or you're hearing something. And anything below this threshold is going to be called subliminal perception. And then you have your difference threshold or just noticeable difference. This one's going to be very important on the MCAT. I know I had a question on Weber's law at least. So this is the minimum change in magnitude required for an observer to perceive two different stimuli as different. So this relates very closely to the threshold of conscious perception, except you're going to describe it as a fraction. So if you're already involved in a stimulus, for example, weightlifting, it's asking how much weight can we add or remove for you to notice a change in the weight. So this is going to follow a percent, and that's what Weber's law states. It states that the difference thresholds are proportional and must be computed as percentages. So imagine you're wearing a 10-pound backpack and noticing it got heavier after adding 0.5 pounds. That means your Weber's Weber's law fraction would be 5% change in stimulus required to notice a difference. That would be your just noticeable difference. If you're wearing a 100-pound backpack and they ask how much weight would it take for you to notice the difference if you're wearing a 100-pound backpack, you would say, oh, it's going to be 5%, so you'd need to add 5 pounds. So those are the type of questions the MCAT's probably going to ask. So that's pretty much it for chapter 1. I want to share these questions. Let's take 5 or 6 minutes to do these. And these are just going to be over chapter 1. So let me launch this poll. And if you guys have any questions, feel free to unmute or ask in the chat. So I got a pretty good question in the chat. Are these slides going to be sent through email or uploaded on here? So I already sent these slides, I think Friday. The first link I sent didn't work, but I sent another email after that with the right link that should work. So I have already sent those out, but when I send another email out, I'll just add these slides there too, if you guys didn't see that, since I messed up the link the first time. I'll keep this open for 2 more minutes. Okay, I think I'm gonna end the poll here. And then we can start reviewing the questions. Okay. Okay. So hopefully you can see that. So the first question, which of the following is true regarding nerve cells? A lot of you guys said A, and try and remember that efferent is saying exiting the CNS. So if you're exiting the central nervous system, that means that the central nervous system is sending information to a muscle for it to do something, right? Like sensory information is not going to be sent from the brain down to the leg, for example. Um, because what is that going to do for your leg? It's not going to enact any change. So just remember, motor information is what's actually being sent. It's going to be exiting the CNS. So those are motor neurons, not sensory neurons. The right answer was sensory neurons transmit information from receptors to the brain. So they're going to be afferent, arriving at the CNS. A child has experienced nervous system damage and can no longer coordinate the movements to dribble a basketball, although she can still walk in an uncoordinated fashion. Which region of the central nervous system was most likely affected? This is going to be your hindbrain. This is what controls movement. Specifically, it's probably going to be her cerebellum or her basal ganglia, and both those parts of the brain are part of the hindbrain. Next question. That's going to be your hypothalamus. It's going to deal with homeostasis and emotions. Your cerebellum is going to be the fine motor control. Your pons is going to be breathing. And then your thalamus is going to be a sensory relay station to all the other parts of your brain. Which of the following neurotransmitters is not classified as a catecholamine? That's going to be acetylcholine. All three of the other ones are the 3 catecholamines. If the amount of acetylcholinesterase, an enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine, is increased, which of the following would most likely be the result? Okay, if you have an enzyme that's breaking down acetylcholine, that means you're going to have less acetylcholine. If you increase that enzyme, you're going to have even more less acetylcholine. So it's going to be weakness of muscle movements because acetylcholine controls muscle movements, voluntary and involuntary. And then which of the following neurotransmitters is associated with both schizophrenia and Parkinson's disease? That's going to be dopamine. People used to think that high serotonin levels were associated with schizophrenia, but recent research has showed that it's actually dopamine. With schizophrenia, it's going to be too much dopamine. With Parkinson's, it's going to be not enough dopamine. Okay, let's move on to learning and memory. And this is going to be 14% of the site content. So I think this is the biggest chapter in the book. So we might be reviewing this one for a little bit. So let's start with learning. So learning is just the way in which we acquire new behaviors. And learning is usually done via a stimulus. So a stimulus is anything to which an organism can respond. Then if there is a stimulus, you can get habituation of that stimulus. That's repeated exposure to the same stimulus. And this is going to cause a decrease in response. So habituation causes a decrease in the response. And dishabituation is going to be a recovery of response to a stimulus after habituation has occurred. And then there's going to be two types of different learnings. There's going to be associative and observational. Associative are the ones we're most familiar with. It's going to be classical and operant conditioning, and it's just a pairing between two stimuli. And then observational, this is just watching somebody and learning based on your observations. So classical conditioning is a pretty big aspect of the MCAT. So is operant conditioning. I'm not going to go through this whole thing because you've probably heard of this before. And if you haven't, I would recommend really looking into classical conditioning, maybe watching the Pavlov's dog experiment video on YouTube. But hopefully you guys know about it. I do have some questions on this. So if you get those wrong, just make sure you review classical conditioning. Something I do want to mention, though, is acquisition. And this is the process of going through classical conditioning and turning a neutral stimulus into a conditioned stimulus. And then you have extinction as well, which is going to be a loss of a conditioned response. Spontaneous recovery, this one's pretty important. So after some time, presenting the exact conditioned stimulus will sometimes produce a weak conditioned response. So usually this happens after extinction. So after extinction has occurred, you can find this spontaneous recovery process happening. And then generalization, this one's also very important. This is when a stimulus similar to the conditioned stimulus can also produce the conditioned response. So for example, if a dog starts salivating to a pork chop, maybe he'll start salivating to a steak, a beef steak or something. So that's generalization. And then stimuli discrimination is when the organism learns to distinguish between similar stimuli. And this is exactly the opposite of generalization. And now we're going to move on to operant conditioning. So operant conditioning focuses on punishment and reward. So pretty much it's going to be associated with behaviorism. And B.F. Skinner is the guy who started behaviorism. And the theory is that all behaviors are conditioned. So you can condition any behavior you want based on these reinforcement and punishment behaviors. So a reinforcement is just anything that's going to increase your behavior. A punishment is anything that's just going to decrease behavior. Okay, so you can have positive and negative reinforcement and punishment. Positive is when you add a stimulus, and negative is when you remove a stimulus. So positive reinforcement, you would add a stimulus to try and get that behavior to increase. Negative punishment would be removing a stimulus, a pleasant stimulus, to try and get the behavior to decrease. So it's like taking candy from a child. It's negative because you're taking the candy away, and it's punishment because you're it's something the child wants. So if you're taking it away, maybe their bad behavior will stop. So within operant conditioning, you have something called escape and avoidance learning. So escape learning is going to be when an animal experiences an unpleasant stimulus. So it behaves in a way to escape the stimulus. It's going to try and run away, get away from that uncomfortable stimulus. Avoidance learning is when an animal displays the desired behavior in anticipation of the unpleasant stimulus. So this comes after multiple experiences of escape learning. And the animal pretty much learns that, okay, I can't escape. So let me try and avoid the unpleasant stimulus. Let me anticipate it. Those are the main important things with operant conditioning. There are these primary and secondary reinforcers, but those are very dependent upon the like the scenario in operant conditioning. Something I do want to mention is discriminative stimulus. So that's going to indicate that a reward is potentially available, such as a dog performing tricks in the presence of a trainer whom he associates with treats. So this isn't the same thing as like conditioned and unconditioned responses. This is pretty much saying that if a reward is available, the dog is going to behave in a way that's going to try and get that reward. For example, if he associates a treat with a trainer, he's going to go towards that trainer because he knows that the trainer has fed him in the past. It's weird. Discriminative stimulus is a bit weird, but if you guys are still confused on that, you can definitely look that up. Reinforcement schedules. These are going to be pretty important. So within reinforcement schedules, you have ratio and interval reinforcements. Ratio is going to be following a number of tries, number of attempts. It's just the number pretty much. And then interval is going to be the time. So you also have fixed and variables under both those. So fixed is going to be the same time, the same each like this, yeah, like the same stimulus each like minute. For example, like fixed ratio is going to be the amount of times, and fixed is just going to mean you're giving the animal like a treat or something every single time at the same time. So fixed ratio is going to be when you reinforce a behavior after specific number of performances of that behavior. So after a mouse presses a lever 4 times in a row, then it's going to get a treat. Variable is it's just the opposite of fixed. So remember, ratio is the number of attempts. So variable ratio would be like the first time the mouse presses the lever, he gets a treat. And then the next time he has to press it 3 times to get a treat. And then he has to press it 2 times to get a treat. It's variable. And this is going to work the fastest for learning a new behavior. So definitely remember that. Because they might ask a question like which reinforcement schedule is the best for teaching a dog this. Variable ratio is going to usually work the faster to make a behavior happen more often. So interval is going to be after the amount of time, not the amount of tries, for example. So fixed interval is going to be you give the mouse a treat after every 2 minutes. That would be fixed interval. Variable interval would be the first time you give a mouse a treat after 1 minute, then you give a mouse a treat after 4 minutes. And this whole process of reinforcing is called shaping, and it's the process of rewarding increasingly specific behaviors that become closer to the desired response. So this is pretty much just saying that you don't need to actually reinforce something. You don't need to directly turn an unconditioned stimulus into a conditioned stimulus. You can do it with steps. So like, for example, if you want a bird to fly into your house, first you would put a treat like close to your house, so the bird first flies close to your house, and then keep getting closer and closer until it eventually goes into your house. And those are pretty much just the main points for reinforcement schedules. So then we have cognitive and biological factors in associative learning. So you have latent learning. This is learning that occurs without a reward, but is spontaneously demonstrated once a reward is introduced. So for example, putting a mouse in a maze that they've never seen before and putting food in the middle of the maze. And if the mouse can find the food in the middle of the maze, that's going to be an example of latent learning, because it's never gone through that maze before. It's never done it before. But the food was a very good, like the food made the mouse want to solve the maze. So that would be an example of latent learning. Problem solving, that's just a trial and error approach. Preparedness, animals are most able to learn behaviors that coincide with their natural behaviors. So an example of this would be rewarding an animal such as a bird for pecking at food. So the animal is going to be, it's going to be really easy for that bird to learn to peck at food, because it already pecks at food in the wild. So that's preparedness. And then instinctive drift. This is when animals revert to an instinctive behavior after learning a new behavior that is similar. So for example, trained raccoons putting coins in a piggy bank, and then they're going to be rubbing the coins together before they put them in the piggy bank, because in the wild they wash their food by rubbing it together. So that's an example of instinctive drift. And then observational learning. This is the second type of learning. This is just watching somebody and learning from them, observing and kind of mimicking almost. So it's not always just imitation, because you can teach individuals to avoid behavior. If you're watching somebody do a behavior and they get hurt, you're gonna not want to do that behavior. So that wouldn't be an example of imitation. And mirror neurons are the cell responsible for this type of observational learning. It's located in the frontal and parietal lobes of the cerebral cortex, and they fire both when an individual performs an action and when the individual observes someone else performing that action. So that's going to be really important in infants, right? So they're watching their parents do a lot of things and they're learning, and those are going to be the mirror neurons that are firing. And then you have modeling, and this is when people learn what behaviors are acceptable by watching others perform them. This is going to be an important factor in determining an individual's behavior throughout their lifetime, especially what the model did rather than what the model said. So this is really important in teaching your infants how to act properly, or just their behaviors. Yeah. Okay, now we're going to move on to memory. So memory, encoding, storage, those are very important terms on the MCAT. So let's start with encoding. Encoding is the process of putting new information into memory. So information gained without any effort is going to be the result of automatic processing. So that's just unconscious, right? You don't need to put effort into remembering that. And then active memorization is controlled processing, right? So that's going to be your effortful processing. You have to put effort. You have to consciously do this to remember. So you have four types of encoding. You have visual encoding, acoustic encoding, elaborative encoding, and semantic encoding. Visual encoding is going to be your weakest type of encoding. And by weakest and strongest, I mean putting encoding in a way that you can recall the information later. So if you're only using visual encoding, it's going to be really hard to recall the information later. This is just visualizing information. Acoustic encoding is storing the information in the way it sounds. Elaborative is pretty important. This is linking information to knowledge that is already in your memory. And then semantic encoding, this is going to be your strongest form of encoding. And this is putting information into the context of something very meaningful. So for example, our own lives. If you're studying for a test and you're saying, let's say you're studying the parts, the bones of the body. Maybe you broke your femur, right? You're gonna say, oh, this bone would be the femur, and you remember that because you broke that part of your leg. That would be semantic encoding. And if you are applying it to your life, that's known as the self-reference effect. A really good way of encoding is called maintenance rehearsal. So these are maintenance rehearsal, mnemonics, and chunking are all just ways of encoding. It helps the information stay in your brain. So maintenance rehearsal is just going to be repeating the information a bunch of times to keep it within your working memory, and be able to store it later in your short-term and possibly long-term memory. Mnemonics are pretty good ways of encoding, and this is just creating acronyms or rhyming phrases that provide vivid organization of information. So there's two types of mnemonics. You're going to have your method of loci. This is associating each term in a list with a location along a route. So if you have like a grocery list, for example, you're going to say, okay, I found eggs in my bed. I went downstairs and ate a ground beef and found milk, taking the trash out. You're kind of putting it in chronological order. And it's just a really good way of organizing your information. And then you have your peg word system, and then this is associating items that rhyme with or resemble numbers. So like if you're trying to remember words, it'd be like 1 is for me, 2 is for he, 3 is for tree, stuff like that. That's peg word system. And then chunking, also known as clustering. This is going to be taking individual elements of a large list and grouping them together into the related or similar meanings. That's also a really good way of encoding. So now we're going to move on to storage. Storage is comes after encoding, and this is when you store information. You can either store it in your short-term or long-term memory. So the first type of memory would be sensory memory, and this preserves information in its original sensory form. It's very fleeting. It only lasts a second or two. And this was demonstrated by flashing a 3x3 array of letters for a second. When asked to list all the letters, this is known as a whole report. If you're asked to list every single aspect of what you saw, that's a whole report. The participant could only identify a few. However, when asked to list the letters of a particular row, this would be a partial report. The participants did it with 100% accuracy. This demonstrates sensory memory because by the time it took somebody to by the time it took somebody to recall the whole report, it took more than a second, right? So all the other parts of that report went away. But if they only have to look at like 5 different things and they can keep that in their memory for a second, they can recall that information really fast before it fleets away. So that's going to be your sensory memory. And within sensory memory, there's iconic and echoic. And this is just a subsection of sensory memory. Iconic would be fast decaying memory of visual stimuli. Echoic would be decaying memory of auditory stimuli. And then after sensory memory, you can put the information into your short-term memory. So this is going to last a little bit longer. This is going to fade after about 30 seconds without rehearsal. And the number of items we can hold in the short-term memory at any given time is called your memory capacity, and it's limited to 7 items, plus or minus 2. You can actually increase this memory capacity by clustering, chunking, or rehearsing different like things. And this is going to be housed in the hippocampus. And then you have working memory. This is very closely related to short-term memory. Working memory is it lasts about the same amount of time as short-term memory. It's pretty much just a subdivision of short-term memory, but it allows you to manipulate information within your memory, within your short-term memory. So if you're like doing math in your head, for example, that's what allows you to say like 2 times 2 equals 4 plus 6. If you have like an algebraic equation, working memory is what allows you to solve that. And then long-term memory, this is going to be limitless pretty much. It's a warehouse for knowledge that we can recall on demand. And a way to increase long-term memory is elaborative rehearsal. And this is going to consolidate information into long-term memory by associating information with knowledge already stored in long-term memory. So you can kind of create this network in your head with different aspects, different like things you already know, and you can combine them in your head. That would be elaborative rehearsal. Let's move on to long-term memory. This diagram right here is really good for looking at memory. So you see sensory memory would be the very first one, less than a second. Short-term memory, working memory are very closely related. And then the last one would be long-term memory. So within long-term memory, there are implicit, also known as non-declarative memories, and there's procedural memories. So implicit are going to be memories that are not consciously recalled. This is going to be like your skills, your habits, conditioned responses. This is going to be like tying a shoe or washing your hands, stuff like that. You don't really have to think about how to do it. Procedural memory is going to be unconscious memory of skills required to complete the procedural tasks. So this is just going to be a subsection of your implicit memory. I don't know why the book puts priming in here, but it is pretty closely associated with all forms of memory, not just long-term memory. But they like to talk about it in terms of long-term memory. So priming is just going to be presenting one stimulus, which affects the second stimulus, the perception of the second stimulus. So positive priming is going to be when you show somebody a stimulus, and that's going to improve processing of the second. Negative priming is just going to be the opposite. You give somebody a stimulus, it's going to decrease the recall of the second stimulus. And then the second type of long-term memory would be explicit, or also known as declarative memory. Also, definitely know these non-declarative and declarative terms because the MCAT likes to use those. So explicit or declarative memory is going to be memories that require conscious recall. And you have two main subdivisions. I'm not too focused on autobiographical memory right now. But episodic memory would be recollection of life experiences. This is pertaining to you and your own life experiences. And then you have semantic memory, which are like ideas, concepts, or facts that we know, but they're not tied to specific events in our life. And then autobiographical memory, it's just a combination of both. It uses memories about our lives, but it could use both semantic and episodic. I'm not too focused on that right now, though. Okay, so let's move on to how we retrieve memory. So retrieval is the process of demonstrating that something has been learned and has been retained in long-term memory. This is different from recall because retrieval could be unconscious, but to recall, you actually have to consciously know something and be able to say it out loud. And then recognition is the process of identifying a piece of information that was previously learned. It's easier than recall because you don't actually have to explicitly say the information. That's recall. And then there's also a process of relearning. You can rememorize information faster when it has already been memorized once. If you've taken a psych class and you're studying for the MCAT psych portion, you're going to learn the information a lot quicker and remember it better the second time around because you already learned it once. That's pretty much relearning. And then within our brains, we have this semantic network. And this is concepts that are linked together based on similar meanings in the brain. When one node of our semantic network is activated, the other linked concepts around it are unconsciously activated, known as spreading activation. So this is very important for combining information in your head. So, for example, if you have a math test coming up on a certain topic, your semantic network would be all the topics within that math test, and maybe math tests you've taken in the past. That would be a semantic network. So then context effect, that's going to be a retrieval cue where memory is aided by being in the physical location where encoding took place. A retrieval cue is just anything that helps you retrieve a piece of information. Source monitoring is going to be part of the retrieval process that involves determining the origin of memories and whether they are real or fictional. So the source of those memories, are they real? Are they not real? State dependent effect is going to say you're going to retrieve information better if you're in the same state as you were when you encoded that information. For example, if you're intoxicated when you learned a piece of information, if you have a test on that information, you're going to do better on the test if you're intoxicated. That's state dependent effect. Serial position effect, this is saying that an item's position, like physical position within a list, affects the way we can recall that. So if we can remember early items in a list, that's going to be known as a primacy effect. If we can remember late items in the list better, that's going to be known as recency effect. If you are given a list, you're going to be using both primary effect and recency effect, because it is easier to remember things at the beginning and end of a list due to these effects. And then you have amnesia. This is a disorder associated with retrieval, and this is the significant loss of memorized information and inability to remember when, where, or how one has obtained knowledge. And that's known as source amnesia. Amnesia is pretty much just loss of memory. Source amnesia, you can't remember where you got that information. Forgetting. So there's a bunch of disorders affecting memory. Alzheimer's disease, like we said, it's linked to a decrease of acetylcholine. And then Korsakoff syndrome, just know that that's also linked to forgetting disorder. And then within Korsakoff syndrome, you can get things like anterograde amnesia, which is the inability to form new memories. And then you can get retrograde amnesia, which is the loss of previous memories. So definitely know the difference between those two as well. Agnosia, this is the loss of ability to recognize objects, people, or sound caused by damage to the brain. Decay, this is just a natural loss of memories over time. Usually happens with age, and it's demonstrated by the curve of forgetting. It's pretty much just a curve showing how much you remember over the years. Interference is going to be a retrieval error caused by the existence of other, usually similar information. So you have proactive interference is when old information is going to interfere with new learning. So like, for example, if you move to a new house and you have a new address, but you can only remember your old address, that would be an example of proactive interference because the old address is interfering with you remembering the new address. Retroactive interference is the opposite. It's when new information is going to cause forgetting the old information. Okay. So aging and memory, this is pretty important as well. Aging alone is not associated with significant memory loss. Older individuals have large semantic networks. They have much larger semantic networks than younger individuals, which allows them to remember things a lot better if they can connect those topics within a semantic network. Just you have better recall of something. But then you have something called prospective memory, which is remembering to perform a task at some point in the future. And with something interesting is with older individuals, this is going to remain intact only in event-based processes. But it declines when it's time-based. So, for example, if an elderly person has a doctor's appointment at a certain time, it might be hard for them to remember which time that doctor's appointment was. That's prospective memory, and that goes down a lot with aging populations. And then all these other terms, They're pretty important. I would know them, mainly the misinformation effect, intrusion errors, and source monitoring errors. So the misinformation effect is going to be a person's recall of an event becomes less accurate due to the injection of outside information into the memory. An intrusion error is going to be false memories that have included a false detail into a particular memory. It's not from an outside source like misinformation, but instead it's coming from an internal source, and where two memories are very similar, so you can't really differentiate between the two. And then you have source monitoring error, and then this is just going to be a confusion between semantic and episodic memories. Remember, semantic is your facts, episodic is your own life experiences. So it's like saying a memory happened to you when it actually happened to a friend. And then just three terms you should know: neuroplasticity. As our brains develop, neural connections form rapidly in response to stimuli. Adult brains are going to show much less plasticity than children's brains. You also have a process of synaptic pruning, which happens more to older individuals. So this is where weak neural connections are going to be broken while stronger ones are bolstered. And then long-term potentiation, which is just strengthening of neural connections through repeated use. It's believed to be the neurophysiological basis of long-term memory and how we actually get information into our long-term memory. Okay, so that is chapter 3. Yep, chapter 3. So let's take the chapter 3 quiz. I think I'll give 10 minutes just because we are running a little bit late. So let me open that quiz right now. Also, I will send out an email with all the answers, all the questions and the answer key on all the questions, all these quizzes, probably tomorrow. So look out for that email. Okay, I think I'm gonna close the poll soon. Just because we don't have too much time, we're already running late and we have one more chapter to cover. But I will send out everything, so don't worry if you didn't finish. You'll get all the questions and answer keys. So you guys can always look at these by yourselves too. Something I did notice though, for question number 4, it's asking which of the following processes would increase the likelihood of an event. And most people got that one wrong. So extinction is going to get rid of the conditioned stimulus or the conditioned response. So that's going to make a behavior less likely to happen. And then punishment both refers to negative and positive punishment both refer to decreasing the likelihood of a behavior. Remember, reinforcement is increasing the likelihood. So negative punishment would be taking something away to make the behavior less likely to happen. Positive punishment would be putting something in to make the behavior less likely to happen. Avoidance learning now, this is after many times of escape learning, the animal anticipates the stimulus, right? So this is going to make it a behavior, avoidance learning is going to make a behavior more likely to occur. It's going to make the avoidant behavior more likely to occur. It's a type of learning. Okay, so let's end that. Okay, so now we're going to move on to chapter 10, social thinking. This is going to be 10% of the psychology content. So this chapter starts with attraction. Interpersonal attraction is just the phenomenon of individuals liking each other. Factors that affect interpersonal attraction are similarity, how similar two people or animals are, such as attitudes, intelligence, education, things like that. Self-disclosure is just sharing one's fears, thoughts, and goals with another person and being met with non-judgmental empathy. This is just pretty much how somebody treats you, and if they're showing you empathy, stuff like that. Reciprocity, this is going to be, this is the phenomenon where people like others better when they believe the other person likes them. And then proximity is people are going to be more attracted to others if they're closer to each other. And this can be explained by the mere exposure effect, also known as the familiarity effect. And it just pretty much says the tendency for people to prefer stimuli that they have been exposed to more frequently. For example, if you grew up eating chicken nuggets, you're gonna like chicken nuggets more than, let's say, a food you didn't grow up eating. So that would be the mere exposure effect. And that explains why proximity is so important in attraction. And then we have these social behaviors of aggression. So aggression is just a behavior that intends to cause harm or increase social dominance. It's controlled by the amygdala. Remember, this is part of your limbic system. And it's also going to be controlled by hormones. So higher testosterone levels have been linked to more aggressive behaviors in animals. And then you have this cognitive neo-association model. This is pretty much just saying we are more likely to respond to others aggressively whenever we are feeling negative emotions. So for example, on a really hot day, heat is actually found to make people like feel negative, like it makes them not feel good if it's like way too hot. So if it's like really hot outside, you might get angry at other people faster. They also found that murder rates increase in the summer, and they think that that's because of this cognitive neo-association model, because people are a lot more aggressive when they're feeling negative emotions such as like heat. social behaviors, attachment. So these are very important. You should definitely know what all these different attachment styles are, and how to apply them. So an attachment is just an emotional bond between a caregiver and a child that begins to develop during infancy. And there's going to be four main types of attachments, right? So there's going to be secure attachment. This is when the child has a consistent caregiver and can go out and explore knowing they have a secure base to return to. This is going to be characterized by the child getting upset when the caregiver leaves and the child being happy when the caregiver returns. Avoidant attachment is when the caregiver has little or no response to a distressed child. So this is going to be your most severe type of negative attachment. The child shows little or no distress when the caregiver leaves, and doesn't care when they return. The ambivalent attachment. So this is where the caregiver has inconsistent responses to a child's distress. The child is extremely distressed on separation from the caregiver, because they don't know if the caregiver is going to come back or not. But then they have a mixed response when the caregiver returns, because now that they came back, the child's not really sad that they're gone, but the child's not really happy because they know this caregiver is not very secure. It's also sometimes called the anxious ambivalent attachment style. And then finally, you have the disorganized attachment style. This is when the child shows no clear pattern of behavior in response to the caretaker's absence or presence, but instead shows a mix of behaviors. So disorganized attachment is often associated with erratic behavior and social withdrawal by the caregiver. For example, if your parent is addicted to a substance, the child may grow up with a disorganized attachment style. So now we're going to move on to social support, which refers to a perception or reality that one is cared for by a social network. And there's a couple different types of social support. There's going to be emotional support, listening, affirming, or empathizing with someone. Esteem support, affirming the qualities and skills of a person, telling them they're good enough to do this. Then you have material, tangible support, financial or material contribution to another person. Informational support, providing information that'll help someone. And then network support, social support that gives a person a sense of belonging within like a group or a network. So just know those different types of supports. These are social behaviors. So we're going to start with foraging. Foraging is just seeking out and eating food. That's pretty much all it refers to. Then there's mating. Mating is a pretty big thing in society. It's just the organization of a group's sexual behavior. And then you have kind of different types of mating systems. You have monogamy, which is exclusive mating relationship. Each mate only has one. So each individual only has one mate with each other. They're not going after other mates. And then you have polygamy, which is the opposite of monogamy. This is going to be an exclusive relationship with multiple partners. One male having multiple female partners is going to be called polygyny, and one female having multiple male partners is going to be called polyandry. And then you have promiscuity, promiscuity. Yeah, promiscuity. Sorry, that was hard. Kind of hard, but member of one sex mating with others without exclusivity. This just pretty much refers to polygamy. They really don't have a preference. And then you have mate choice. So this is just how you select a mate. And this mate bias is what allows you to choose a mate. So this is going to refer to how choosy members of a species are while choosing a mate. And so there's 5 mechanisms for an organism to choose a mate through this mate bias phenomenon. So the first one is going to be phenotypic benefits. These are going to be observable traits that make a potential mate more attractive to the opposite sex. For example, in humans, it would be like facial hair, strength, something like that. There's direct phenotypic benefits, which are going to directly improve the survival, the inclusivity of the offspring or of the mate. And then indirect benefits would be making the offspring more viable. So an example of an indirect phenotypic benefit would be a female peacock choosing a very large peacock because it's going to make their offspring more likely to survive and be stronger. Indirect pretty much just refers to offspring. Direct refers to the mates themselves. And then you have sensory bias. This is going to be development of a trait to match a pre-existing preference that already exists in a population. For example, like going back to the peacock, the feathers of a peacock, females choose male peacocks with brighter feathers. So sensory bias would say that, oh, male peacocks are going to develop brighter feathers evolutionarily because they need to match this trait, match this preference that already exists. Then you have Fisherian or runaway selection. This is going to be a positive feedback mechanism in which a trait that has no effect or a negative effect on survival becomes more exaggerated over time. Sensory bias and Fisherian runaway selection are very similar, but they're referring to two different aspects of a mate's choice. So if you don't get that, just look it up a little bit. Wikipedia does a pretty good job of differentiating them. Then you also have indicator traits. These are going to be traits that signify overall good health and well-being of an organism. So indicator traits can also provide these phenotypic benefits. And then you have genetic compatibility. This is just going to be organisms mate with individuals that they can have viable offspring with. Then you have helping behavior. So altruism refers to forms of helping behavior in which an individual's intent is to benefit another at some cost to the self. And then you have empathy, which is the ability to experience emotions of another, strong influence on helping behavior. So if you have high empathy, you're more likely to help somebody. Then there's this empathy altruism hypothesis. One individual helps another person when they feel empathy for the other person, regardless of the cost. It's a combination of both. It's pretty much saying people are more altruistic if they have empathy for the situation. Game theory, it's kind of a whole section in the book. Pretty much, it's just a way of organizing information and organizing it in a way that describes decision-making behavior. So in our sense, the evolutionary stable strategy is going to be a type of game, is going to be a form of game theory. So what it's saying is when the evolutionary stable strategy is adapted by a given population in a specific environment, natural selection will prevent alternative strategies from arising. Thus, the strategies are inherited with the object of the game becoming more fit. So this is pretty much saying overall, in a general sense, organisms are going to adapt to their environment so that natural selection can make them more stronger over time. It can make them more inclusive over time. And there's 4 possible alternatives for competitors when dealing with interactions. So imagine you have 2 squirrels walking around in a population. So you can either have altruism, where the donor provides a benefit to the recipient at a cost to them. So for example, the donor is going to leave the acorn on the ground so the recipient can grab it. Then you have cooperation, which is both donor and recipient benefit by cooperating. So this is when they're both benefiting. This would be an example of this would be if the squirrel finds an acorn on the ground, finds 2 acorns on the ground, it would only take one and leave the other for the recipient. So they're both benefiting. Spite is going to be both donor and recipient are negatively impacted. So for example, the donor finds 1 acorn, but he doesn't want the other squirrel to get the acorn. So he takes the acorn and throws it in the water. So they both lose. And then you have selfishness. This is when the donor is going to benefit while the recipient is negatively impacted. And this is going to be the opposite of, this is going to be the opposite of altruism. So an example of selfishness would be the donor donor finds an acorn on the ground and then just takes it for themselves. That would be selfishness. Okay, now we're going to move on to social perceptions and behavior. So within social perceptions, so a social perception is going to be the tools or the judgments and impressions regarding others that somebody makes. So there's 3 components to social perception. There's going to be the perceiver, the target, and the situation. The perceiver is just going to be the one making the judgment. The target is going to be the one they're judging, and the situation is where they are, the environment. So you're going to have this thing called impression bias when you're making judgments for the first time about somebody. So impression bias is the selection of certain cues to form interpretation of others that are consistent over time. So for example, if you meet somebody and they give you a cookie, the next time you meet them, you're going to say, oh, they're really nice because they gave me a cookie. But if they do something bad, you're not gonna look at that cue. You're gonna look at if they do something good the second time because you already think that they're a good person because the first time you met them, they gave you a cookie. Even if they are bad, you're not going to be able to tell because you're nitpicking cues. And then the primacy effect refers to the idea that the first impressions are often the most important, while recency effect states that the most recent information is the most important. And when you are making judgments about somebody, there are different things you can rely on. So you can rely on central traits. This is when individuals tend to organize the perception of others based on traits and personal characteristics. So just like I said, intelligence, for example, if you're making a judgment about somebody, the first thing you might judge them on is their intelligence, right? Because that's a central trait. That's something that's important to you. Implicit personality theory. These are sets of assumptions that people make about how different types of people, their traits, and their behaviors are related. And this often leads to stereotyping because you're kind of grouping people together just based on certain impression cues. The halo effect is a cognitive bias in which judgments about a specific aspect of an individual can be affected by one's overall impression of the individual. So, for example, like I was saying before with the impression bias, if somebody gives you a cookie and you really like them, and the next time you see them, you see them do something awful, like you see them punch somebody in the face, you're gonna still think about them as a good person because the first overall judgment you have of them, the most important judgment you have about them is their kindness because they gave you a cookie. So that's halo effect. Just role hypothesis. This is pretty much saying that good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. It denies the possibility of innocent victims. So it's just pretty much saying like if you get hit by a car, it's your fault. It's another way of making judgments. Self-serving bias, this is when individuals credit their own successes to internal factors and blame failures on external factors. So for example, if you're taking a test and you do really good, you're going to say, oh, I'm so smart. If you do really bad, you're going to say, I didn't get enough sleep last night. Something like that. In-group bias, this is when you view members in your own group more favorably. Out-group bias, view members outside of one group harshly. Attribution theory. So attribution is going to describe how individuals infer the causes of others' behaviors. So you have these dispositional internal attributions, and then you have these situational attributions. So these dispositional ones are going to be beliefs, attitudes, and personality traits about somebody. Situational ones are going to be features or of the surrounding environment or just outside factors in general. So you have different cues. So you have a consistency cue. This is of a behavior of a person over time. So people use these cues to make attributions. The consensus cue, extent to which a person's behavior differs from others. And distinctiveness cues, extent to which a person engages in similar behavior across a series of scenarios. So if all these cues line up with each other, then you might make a good attribution. Or you might make a dispositional attribution. But if, let's say, consensus cue doesn't line up, you might make a situational attribution about somebody. Fundamental attribution error. If I could stress anything, it would be no fundamental attribution error. So this is saying we are generally biased towards making dispositional internal attributions rather than situational ones when judging the actions of another. Okay, so this is saying that if somebody sitting next to you, if one of your friends does really bad on a test, you're going to say, oh, you're a dumb person, instead of maybe thinking about the fact that they didn't get enough sleep that night, or maybe there's some kind of outside factor that made them do really bad on the test, but you're just attributing it to the fact that they're not as smart as you, right? That would be a fundamental attribution error, and it occurs more frequently in individualist cultures like the United States. Attribute substitution. This is pretty much when individuals must make judgments that are complex, where their judgments don't really line up. So instead, they just substitute a simpler solution that's not really accurate. I don't really have an example of that one right now, but just know that too. Last couple slides. So stereotypes. These last 3 slides are pretty important. I know the MCAT likes to ask a lot of questions on stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. So stereotypes are going to be when attitudes or impressions are based on limited and superficial information about a person or a group. And then you have the stereotype content model, right? So this is going to classify stereotypes with respect to an in-group. So pretend you're an in-group, right? Using dimensions of warmth. Warmth refers to groups that are not in direct competition with the in-group, okay? And then competence, which refers to groups that have high status in society. So there's going to be 4 subdivisions within this model. It's going to be paternalistic, which occurs when a group has high warmth, which is not competitive, or non-competitive, and it's going to have low competence. So they're going to have a low status in society. So an example of this is going to be like elderly people. So they have a pretty low status in society, and they don't really compete with any in-groups, right? The contemptuous model is when the group is viewed with resentment, annoyance, or anger. So they're going to have a low status because they have low competence, and they're going to have low warmth because they are competitive with each other. So like poor people, for example, the group is just resented. You have the envious model. This is high status and very competitive. This is going to be like maybe wealthy people. Yeah. Admiration. This is going to be high status in society, but they're not competitive. So this is when the group is viewed with a lot of pride and positive feelings. And then we have the self-fulfilling prophecy. So the self-fulfilling prophecy is very important within stereotypes. This is going to be expectations of certain groups or individuals based on stereotypes, which create conditions that then cause the expectations to become reality. So for example, an expectation, well, first let me read stereotype threat. So a person is concerned or anxious about inadvertently confirming a negative stereotype, which often results in the self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, so for example, you have one girl and 15 guys all taking a math test. And let's say a stereotype is girls aren't as good at math as guys, right? So the stereotype there is that they're not as good. So that would be a stereotype threat, because if the girl knows about that stereotype, then she's going to get anxious, and it could possibly cause the self-fulfilling prophecy to happen, meaning she does worse on her test than any of the other guys because of this stereotype threat that was put on her. Now, prejudice, this is going to be irrational, positive or negative attitudes towards a person, group, or thing. So this is just going to refer to attitudes, while stereotypes are going to while stereotypes are going to talk about impressions and like superficial information, whereas prejudice is a negative, or it could be positive, mostly negative attitude towards a person, group, or thing prior to an actual experience with that entity. There's 3 important social factors influencing prejudice. There's power, prestige, and class. Know those 3. Ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is a type of prejudice, and it's pretty much just saying my culture is better than yours. And then cultural relativism is the opposite of ethnocentrism, recognizing that social groups and cultures should be studied on their own terms, and they're not all the same. Finally, discrimination. Discrimination is when a prejudicial attitude causes an individual of a particular group to be treated differently from others. Okay, so discrimination now doesn't refer to attitudes, but treatment. Okay, it refers to behaviors and actual physical behavior. Within discrimination, you have individual discrimination and institutional discrimination. Pretty self-explanatory. Individual discrimination, one person discriminating against a particular person or group. It's conscious, it's obvious, usually easy to fix by addressing that one person. Institutional discrimination, on the other hand, discrimination against a particular group or person by an entire institution. It's built into society, so it's a lot harder to see, and it's a lot harder to change. And that's the end of that. I do have one more poll. So today we did cover 32% of all psychology content. I wouldn't just use what I put on these slides for studying. I kind of just put all the definitions and vocab words, but if you actually want to know how they apply, I've been trying to give you guys examples so you kind of get the idea better, but if you guys actually want to know how they apply and everything, I would do more information or more research. This is supposed to aid in your studying, not really replace it. Regardless, let's do the last quiz. And then I do want to ask you guys a question before we end the meeting today. So I'll keep this quiz open till a lot of people already left. So I feel like you guys are the ones who actually are concerned with the questions and studying. So I'll just keep it open until all you guys finish. Also, one more question. So this has been our first meeting and it was extremely long. So I'm not sure if it works out, but I want to know what you guys think about it, about the structure. So you guys can unmute or talk in the chat if you want, but I definitely want to know if you like the way we're presenting the information right now, or if there's something else you'd rather do. More time for quizzes. Okay, yeah, that's definitely a big one. I think we're gonna do Kahoots instead of these quizzes. We're just working on getting funding right now. So when we actually do the Kahoots, it's gonna be a lot easier. And people will be able to do it faster since there's a timer. So hopefully that'll be ready next week. But I will send out all the questions and answers so you guys can always review those. It's good so far, but yeah, the length is quite a bit more than expected. Yeah. That's another thing. I don't know. It's really hard since we are studying for the MCAT. There's just so much information to cover. I was thinking maybe like an hour a week, but looking at today's lecture, I don't think that's going to be viable. I don't know if we're going to finish every single section, so we might have to start doing 2 hours on Sundays. And if we finish early, we finish early. But I think next week we're going to start doing 2 hours instead of just one. And maybe we'll change the time so more people can come as well. Are there different meeting times / days? So right now we only have it set up for Sundays. We were thinking of doing group study sessions, which wouldn't be on the Sundays. They'd probably be it'd probably be during the week sometime where we can rent a room in the library, and we would just kind of go over maybe some of the lecture things. And then you guys can like come up to the exec board. Since we've already taken like the MCAT, you guys can ask us about strategies and stuff like that. And since we did make these lectures, like we know a lot of the information. So I'm thinking about doing that, but that would have to be later down the line for I think that would just be better later down the line since people are going to start studying for the MCAT like probably around October anyway. Group study to go over lectures would be great. Okay. I think 2 hours would be good, and I like the timing too, but I think we should have breaks in between. It would get more people engaged, I feel like. Yeah, that's a good point. By breaks, do you mean where we're doing something, or we just kind of like take like a little breather and not do anything and then start lecturing again? Yep, I recorded today's Zoom meeting. It'll be posted. I think we're gonna start recording them from now on. I'll send everybody the link in the emails. I'll send the Zoom recording if I can figure out how to do that. I'll send the Zoom recording. I'll send the worksheet with the answers, the Zoom link for next week's class, and I think that's going to be it for that email. Oh, and the PowerPoint for next week as well. Yeah, it'll be emailed. Are you going to send out the questions right after the meeting? I was thinking of doing that tomorrow. Yeah, I think I'm going to do that tomorrow. Sending out the questions right after the meeting. Okay, yeah. Asel, I don't know if that's how you say it, but yeah, just like a 10 to 15 minute break in between doing nothing. Okay, yeah, that works. We'll definitely see if things are running a bit long. I think I could just keep the quizzes open a little bit longer. And then that could kind of be like our 10 to 15-minute break. If I'm made aware beforehand, I can make the longer meetings work. Oh, okay. I can make the longer meetings work, but yeah, I agree about the breaks during. Okay, yeah, we'll try that. And then I would be against the breaks as I liked it more to be concentrated and to the point. Okay. Yeah, so I think it'd be smart. The breaks are definitely a good idea, but since it is like a lot to cover, I think the breaks are just going to be me leaving the quizzes open so everybody can finish them. And it'll be like at least 10 minutes. And if everybody finished within 10 minutes, maybe we'll just do an extra 5 minutes without any like talking or just waiting. The quizzes work well as breaks, yeah. Perfect. All right, I'll see you guys next week. I'll make sure to get that email out to you hopefully tomorrow. Thanks, guys.